This is Outcomes, a show about uncovering the hundreds of micro-innovations that help make Australia's healthcare system one of the best in the world. On the show, you'll meet the doers, the Australian clinicians, care workers and healthcare professionals driving the micro-changes we seek to showcase. Theirs are the stories we're here to tell. I'm your host, Will Egan, and I'm the CEO of AusMed Education. I'm really passionate about improving the health and prosperity of the people in my community. I believe Australia does have a great health system, and every conversation we have on this show highlights why. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Jennifer Graebe, the Senior Director of Nursing Continuing Professional Development and Joint Accreditation Programs at the American Nurses Credentialing Center, ANCC for short. Let me ask you this. Have you ever wondered why we measure the value or impact of learning using time? There are many aspects of the now normal approach to education that probably need to be changed. We discuss this and more on today's show. Jennifer describes a regulatory model that measures learning using outcomes. Round of applause, please. Nick, got to edit that in. Imagine how much this would improve everyone's experience of learning, let alone its potential to impact the quality of care. We don't stop there though. Jen delves into what you can do in your own learning environment to action this change, and the multitude of resources available from the ANCC. AusMed is Australia's only ANCC accredited provider, and we have been for the past 12 years. We've actually maintained it with distinction. This model works here. We're living testament to that. Jen is a world-renowned expert in her field, and it's a real pleasure to have her dialing in to the show from New Jersey in the USA. Without further ado, let's jump into the conversation. Welcome, Dr. Jennifer Graebe. It's fantastic to have you on the show.
Great to be here.
Tell us about your background and where are you talking to us from today?
Sure. So if you haven't already heard in my accent, I'm actually from New Jersey, and my family, we're from the boroughs of New York City. So not only do I have a New Jersey accent, but I also have a little bit of a New York City accent. But you have an accent too. That's true.
We'll both get to enjoy each other's accent.
Yes, exactly. Although yours sounds probably a little bit more sophisticated than mine. But anyway, my name is Jennifer Graebe, and I am a registered nurse in the United States. I currently work for the American Nurses Credentialing Center as Senior Director for Accreditation and Professional Development for both nursing and interprofessional continuing education.
Wonderful. I've already got so many questions, to be honest. Probably the best place to start is to talk about why there's a need for a centre like this. Why does something like this exist in the US? Because we don't have that here in Australia.
That's a great question. And if it's okay with you, I'd like to take us on a little journey.
Go for it.
Around 130 years ago, there was a guy named Carnegie who created the credit system, which we use in the United States for academic learning. So a credit system is a category that's used to make sure that students in academic settings meet certain credit numbers in order to graduate. And along with that credit system is a grading system. I know that system is transferable across the world. I'm not sure if you use that system in Australia, but Carnegie created that system not to be a measure of learning or not to align to what a student knows, can do, or even show as a result of achieving an academic degree. Actually, the credit system was more importantly designed to measure the time that professors were spending in the learning environment to help support their tenure tracks and also their pensions, their retirements. But somehow, in some way, it transferred to the student and created the grading system and the credit system that we know today. If we fast forward about 50 to 60 years, the American Medical Association at that time in the United States was creating a medical continuing education system to ensure public safety. And it was really about making sure that medical doctors in the US were engaging in learning outside of their academic training as a medical doctor. to ensure that they were staying abreast of the best available evidence, that they were engaging in research, that they were not using outdated or antiquated medical procedures, and that they were on top of new medical clinical practice guidelines. And that system adopted the credit system out of the academic system and created a time-based system around continuing medical education. Around the same time, the American Nurses Association did the same thing to create a system of lifelong learning, professional development. At that time, it was called continuing nursing education for nurses, and similarly, as a way to protect the public and ensure that nurses were engaging in professional development that was consistent with evidence-based practice, research, making sure that they were on top of the latest and greatest clinical practice guidelines, and so forth. State nursing boards, state medical boards, board certifiers also started to adopt similar systems for relicensure. So when it came time for physicians and nurses to go through relicensure, they had to, in many cases, submit portfolio or evidence of engaging in that learning. It was time-based, not outcomes-based, meaning that it was an input of the number of either continuing education activities or the number of hours that were spent in a learning environment. But it did not require at that time outcomes attached to it. So for example, if a nurse spent 2 hours in the learning environment, what was calculated and captured as evidence of learning was that 2 hours, not the outcomes, what they learned, what they were able to do as a result of engaging in that learning.
The role of the AMA and the ANA, American Medical Association, American Nursing Association, at that point in time was not a regulatory body, it's a professional association.
They're professional associations, exactly. However, they do create the scopes and standards for practice. I'll speak specifically to nursing.
Yeah.
The American Nurses Association houses the scopes and standards of practice for professional nurses, code of ethics, and so forth. So although they're not a regulatory body like a state board of nursing that regulates practice, they do, for lack of a better word, create and control the scopes and standards of practice for which those regulations are derived from. So it's expected that as a registered nurse, I would adhere to those scopes and standards, and I would adhere to the code of ethics.
Okay. And it sounds like that may have started around 1940s, 50s, 60s, maybe post-World War II.
Correct.
Based on your time.
Yes.
Maybe just explain how someone becomes a registered nurse in the US. Is it at a federal level or is it on a state-by-state basis?
That's a good question, and I'll speak experientially here. How I obtained my license is I graduated from an accredited academic program, and then I had to sit for a licensing exam. That licensing exam, regardless of the state in which a nurse is going to work, that licensing exam is the same for all nurses within the United States, and it's called the NCLEX. Please don't ask me what that acronym means, but it's NCLEX.
Don't ask me either.
So, listeners, you can Google it. But it's an NCLEX exam that all prospective nurses will have to sit and pass in order to be able to practice nursing in the United States. So once you pass that licensing exam, you submit your transcripts, other forms of evidence of criminal background, all of that stuff to the state in which you hope to work. And then they will submit your license. And when you're working in that state, it's expected that you follow and you adhere to the state board of nursing policy or scope of practice within that state. And that can vary from state to state.
And that's the thing, right? So it is different in all 50 states. And my understanding is that some, even to this day, maybe 40% still don't have a continuing nursing education requirement as part of relicensure?
Yeah, not all the states. So all of the states require that a nurse graduate from an accredited program in order to sit for the NCLEX and then be able to be licensed. Those are eligibility requirements. When you go for relicensure, so you have to do that every couple years, not every state in the United States requires evidence of continuing education in order to have your license reevaluated and then you're relicensed.
Okay.
So it's basically an extension of your original license.
Moving on to the next part. So it sounds like we've found the source of where education was measured by duration, not outcomes or benefit really, but just sheer time. Is this the source, the Carnegie model for credit-based measure of learning?
You know, in the modern day, to your point, post World War II, regulation and enhanced regulation in healthcare, and specifically for nursing, it was around, and it's not at the federal level, it is at the state level, the states requiring licensure for practice. That's a level of protection. Those requirements have become more rigorous over time. The NCLEX, so all nurses taking a licensing exam. Entry to practice was defined. We had different entry points, diploma programs, associate degree programs, baccalaureate programs. And so an entry point into practice starts now at the associate degree. And so with that also came this morphing and evolution of professional development requirements. And it was 50 years ago, this year actually, that the accreditation standards that were housed, the accreditation program that was housed within the American Nurses Association, moved into its newest subsidiary, the American Nurses Credentialing Center. And that's where the standards became far more rigorous, far more focused on outcomes, and really incorporated educational design, adult learning principles. And not a lot of people realize this, but the board certification program within the ANCC, and it was called primary accreditation at the time, the professional development accreditation programs are what founded the American Nurses Credentialing Center. A lot of people think it was the magnet recognition program, but it was actually these two programs that were founded and really formalized as credentialing programs under the ANCC when that moved out of the ANA into its subsidiary.
I'm one of those people that thought that it came from the magnet program as well.
Yeah, and why you see it resonant in magnet criteria, pathway to practice criteria, transition to practice criteria, professional development is a core element within all of those recognition programs or accreditation programs that derived from the original professional development accreditation program, the primary accreditation program.
When I talk to people across Australia, maybe half know what a magnet hospital is and half don't. We actually have 3 magnet hospitals here in Australia, and I think we have one on a pathway to magnet accreditation as well. What is a magnet accredited hospital?
Magnet recognition recognizes excellence in nursing practice. It recognizes educational requirements. It recognizes quality research. It recognizes some components of well-being, recognizes the impact of professional development in interprofessional teams and learning. And so those hospitals need to meet certain metrics and benchmarks in order to be recognized as a magnet hospital.
So it's essentially a measure of a framework and a set of measures around really high quality performance in those areas.
Correct.
All right, so we're still, I think, in the 1960s or 70s, thereabouts, with
Yep.
the stories. Where does that lead us today? Because I think the last decade in particular has been particularly interesting.
Yeah, the last decade's been great. So with the ANCC being founded 50 years ago, we've had several iterations of the accreditation criteria over time. And with every iteration that our commission looks at and evaluates, they're really looking at, obviously, the research around adult learning principles and best practices around educational design. But they continue to move further and further away from accreditation criteria being transactional to accreditation criteria being transformational. And it was in 2015 with the last really overhaul of the accreditation criteria where they eliminated pretty much everything and anything that was related to transaction or not related to the processes, the people, or the output or outcomes around accreditation. And with that also came more rigor around evaluation of educational activities, evaluation of learners or teams of learners or groups of learners, and requiring accredited organizations to demonstrate that impact through quality outcomes around the impact of professional development and what they were also going to do as an accredited organization to continue to meet their North Star, whatever that North Star was or is as defined by that organization. And with that shift in that movement also came a new model. So we still recognize the time-based model. It still has a place in the learning environment today. But the commission also recognized that there was something else emerging that was disruptive, challenged the credit system, and challenged the concept of showing up for a course, receiving a certificate of completion and leaving, and that learner not really being able to articulate what they learned, what they can now show and or do as a result of engaging in that activity. And that model is called the outcomes-based continuing education model. It's the only model that exists in the world.
It sounds amazing. To be honest, it sounds amazing.
At the same time that the ANCC did this, there was a shift happening, and this shift is happening globally. It's not just happening in the United States, but I'll speak to what I know about that shift in the US is this concept of competency-based education, where learners, and specifically nurses, can be awarded degrees in the absence of the credit system, in the absence of grades. And through a competency-based education learning process, which I'll now use the acronym CBE, through a CBE model, the learner is charged to go through a series of assessments where they have to demonstrate mastery of those assessments related to the identified competencies. So they no longer receive a letter grade just to receive a letter grade. They actually have to be scored against competencies and meet those competencies at the level of mastery that's been identified. And oftentimes when I use the word mastery, people think that means expert or distinguished, and it actually doesn't. I'm going to go back to something I said that's really important because that directly aligns to our outcomes-based CE model, is mastery at the level that it's been identified, which means it could be basic or it could be competent. And then you would expect that a nurse who has experience, who has advanced practice, would function, or even in the academic setting, learn at a higher level. So that level of mastery is going to be higher, where it could be higher level competency, higher level expert, all the way through proficient to distinguished. That same concept is resonant in our outcomes-based CE model, where it is entirely designed around what is expected of that learner to learn based on the underlying educational needs that have been identified, whether it's knowledge, skill, and or practice, and they must achieve those competencies and learning outcomes that have been identified, where in the traditional model, that's not an expectation. They also don't receive ANCC contact hours. This is learning literally in the absence of time. It's not a time-based model. It can take the learner as much time or as little time as they need to master the concepts and master the competencies. But that time, that component of time, is absent. It's nowhere within the model. Can't even be integrated into the model if someone tried. We also have created the only currency in the world right now for professional development in nursing around a non-time-based, non-credit-based system of learning.
So an outcomes-based currency.
Yes, it's called outcomes-based CE level credit. So we still use the word credit, but it's not related to time. It's related to achievement of different levels where knowledge, skill applied in an educational-like setting, practice, and then integration and dissemination. So it's a stepwise approach.
Wow, my mind's like moving a million miles an hour, because the paradigm here very much is centered around time. So minimum of 20 hours for a registered nurse, maybe up to 40 or 50 depending on number of endorsements or additional qualifications. But one of the things we've tried to champion for as long as I've worked here, which is now almost more than 15 years, is focusing on the outcome.
Mm-hmm.
We have this kind of phrase that we use, which is, so what? Did it actually work? Did it actually change behavior? Did it lead to an improvement in patient care? But that seems very ephemeral. It doesn't feel tangible. An auditor, would struggle to ask, for meaningful evidence of that. How has this program been met from that perspective, both at the individual level, but also has it moved into the workplace? So replacing things like mandatory training or competency-based education.
With every new product, right, there's either slow movement into identifying the need for the product and then actually using the product, or there's a fast uptake, right? And this has been a slow uptake. And the reason for it is because it's a major disruptor. It's uncomfortable for a lot of people, and it's uncomfortable for people who are very used to this credit-based, time-based system. And it's not for everyone. I will tell you, it's not for all of our accredited organizations because it requires collaboration with the learner or the learners. So not a lot of our accredited providers have that luxury of being able to work with a learner one-on-one or having the ability to work with a group of learners. In some cases, they are providers of continuing education and their learners are unknown to them. So I want to preface the fact that the outcomes-based CE model doesn't work for every accredited provider, but for those that have the ability to engage with it or find a way to engage with it, it is having profound impact. One, because it engages the learner. So we know when, as humans, when we are more engaged in a learning environment, we're more apt to learn, retain that learning, and apply that learning either in practice or life. Think about kindergartners, or I don't know what you call it in Australia, but
kindergarten as well.
Okay, for 5-year-olds, right?
Yep.
They are being stimulated and engaged all day long. Why? Because they know, those teachers know that 5-year-old brain is a sponge. And if they don't continue to engage that 5-year-old, they're going to turn and they're going to get distracted and they're not going to engage in the learning. And because their brain needs it, the human brain needs it. I'm 49 years old. My human brain needs engagement. I need to be constantly engaged in learning in order to perform at the highest level that I can. Mm-hmm. Nurses need that no matter what stage of practice they're in, no matter how old they are. And the outcomes-based CE model gives them that ability to identify what they need to be better nurses, to be better providers of nursing care. In some cases, that content is non-traditional. It could be around how to have less stress. It could be around how to better perform CPR. It could be, I need to know what to do during a precipitous delivery because that is low volume, high risk, and I don't have the time to learn that. And so they engage in a different type of learning where they're not reading about something and then everybody's crossing their fingers hoping that learning is retained, that reading of a document is retained. This is about creating a learning journey, creating a journey that is learner-centric, that is based on their identified gaps, their identified needs, that will then improve not their knowledge, their ability to apply that knowledge in a skill-like setting, or their ability to apply that knowledge in practice, or at the highest level, their ability to demonstrate impact. That's what that model looks like. And when a learner engages in that type of model, that learning becomes less transactional and more transformational, because to your point earlier, they don't walk out of that learning environment and they're not able to articulate anything. It was just a transaction. In this model, they are actually creating a professional development portfolio of evidence of learning and how that evidence is improving who they are, not just as a human, but also as a nurse.
I'm wondering how you measure the outcome and also who's responsible for it. Is it the learner? Is it both the educator or the company that's providing the education? Where does the responsibility to ensure that outcomes are being achieved through learning come from through this model?
It is the responsibility of the learner to actively engage in the learning process. And it's the responsibility of the facilitator of learning to support that engagement and facilitate that learning. It is the learner's responsibility to make sure that they are achieving the outcomes that they have identified. And it's the facilitator of learning, their responsibility to make sure that happens. What's really nice about this model too, is if the learner and the facilitator recognize what we have designed here is not working. The learning outcomes are not being achieved. The competencies are not being achieved. Let's take a step back. It doesn't end there and they don't fail. This model is actually created around one word, success. So they stop, and I'm going to use a word that some people in nursing love, some people don't appreciate it, but it's called pivot. They're going to stop and pivot. And they're going to redesign the activity so that the learner is successful. Because there are a lot of times where learners in a traditional learning environment and they're going, this doesn't apply to me. I already know this. I already do this. Or this has nothing to do with my practice environment. Or the rules and regulations within the healthcare institution or within the state I'm working don't let me do this. So then there's a barrier to that learning. The outcomes-based CE model removes all of that because it is completely relevant and applicable to what the learner needs or the group of learners, because it can be a team of learners also. So it's both of their responsibility to ensure the outcomes are met. Also, in this model, the currency, the credit, cannot be awarded unless the outcomes and the competencies that were identified are achieved. So again, what they might have thought was one activity can still be that same activity, but they've actually revised it several times in order to make sure that that learning journey is realistic and relevant and that they can actually achieve the outcomes that they've set out to achieve.
That makes a lot of sense. And does the measure of outcomes ever include things like the patient experience or a quality indicator going down?
Yes. Yeah, it can actually.
Can you talk a little bit about examples of how that's been incorporated?
I'll briefly go through the different levels. Level 1 is knowledge, and how that's evaluated is through assessment of knowledge. It could be verbal assessment, so the learner's talking to a facilitator of learning about what they learned.
Is that essentially like reflective practice?
It could be, yeah. Yep. It could be through tests, but I will caveat that if you're going to create a test, make sure the test is valid and reliable and is testing only what you want that learner to know. So it really has to eliminate all of the fluff. And level 2 is application of knowledge and skill. So you can use case studies, reflective practice again to talk about how you would apply that knowledge in a skill-like setting. Level 3 is skill. So it's the learner being assessed in an educational-like setting. So it could be gaming, it could be adaptive learning, it could be a simulation or in a simulation center. Level 4 is practice. The only way that you can assess for application of knowledge and skill in practice is through direct observation or proxy measures like quality data, patient outcome data. I do want to mention that in this model, learner self-report is not applicable because of all of the reasons why learner self-report is not applicable. Because a learner will self-identify or self-rate themselves a lot higher sometimes, or they may actually rate themselves lower. And so it's not a valid and reliable measure when we're looking at competency and we're looking at achievement of outcomes. So the data, the assessment points, the assessment methods have to be tangible and they have to produce something other than the learner saying, oh yes, I've learned something and this is what I did as a result of that learning.
All right, that's interesting. Essentially, it's not subjective.
Correct.
It needs to be highly objective, evidenced, essentially.
Yep, highly objective. And then the last one, level 5, is impact. So how did that learning impact X and disseminating that? So it can be through sharing that, through their organization, it can be through publication, and that is really reserved for learners that use this model in research, in evidence-based practice. If they want to use impact as a case study, maybe an M&M, morbidity, mortality, maybe Schwartz rounds, things like that, where they're going to use that information to disseminate what they learned and how they applied that learning. That's a much harder one to achieve, actually, because they don't have to go through the other levels to achieve level 5, but they have to demonstrate evidence of all the other levels to achieve level 5. So they can't just get level 5 for a publication. They have to demonstrate how they got to that publication.
Yeah, so it's progressive through the stages. And
correct.
That level 5 sounds a little bit like a quality improvement initiative.
It could be, yep.
So I've learned something and now I want to affect that change across the whole ward.
Correct. Or it could be a change in a policy as a result of that learning or a quality improvement project. Correct. Yep.
It's a fantastic model. It's exactly how it should be, really. In an environment where the extrinsic motivator, that being regulation or relicensure in the US, registration here in Australia, really still must be counting credits or points or units or hours or whatnot. is it, I know you said earlier that they can't be kind of derived from the competency credit.
Mm-hmm.
So is there a lack of an extrinsic motivator for somebody to engage in learning under these auspices?
Yeah, I think so. I think that goes back to your earlier question of the so what, right? And so that's part of really building a community of practice around this. And I often say that this model is a great model to capture and recognize learning where learning was not being captured and recognized in the past. For example, quality improvement projects, performance improvement, research, evidence-based practice, clinical ladder projects, anything related to committee work or shared governance work where they're learning to improve their practice. Because it's self-paced, self-directed, and the learner is so centric to the model. And our traditional model is where the facilitator of learning creates the activity and then people show up and then they leave. This model is not like that. It's on a continuum and it's a really fluid process. And so this model is actually being used, like I said, in cases where that traditional learning wasn't as easily applied or effective. Correct. Preceptor development, leadership development, where they're out working and they're applying what they've learned. Again, it's in that, stepwise approach. It also is a really great model to use when you have performance needs.
Yep.
Because it's not punitive. We want people to be successful. So if a manager on a clinical unit identifies a gap in practice, rather than forcing that nurse to sit through 15 hours of content, they can say to the learner, I want you to be successful. Let's create a learning journey around your performance.
Yeah.
It's a game changer around that.
Yeah, absolutely. I can relate to both those situations.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about learning and development teams here in Australia kind of have two generic responsibilities, I suppose. One that's put in place through regulation, standards frameworks, quality frameworks, whatever they may be, to essentially do mandatory training.
Mm-hmm.
And, that is like a tick and flick exercise. Sometimes, aspirationally, we want it to be as effective and as useful as possible. But at the end of the day, it is about evidence development, creating a record, and then, collecting those records of learning such that you can be sure, maybe meet an insurance obligation, or a risk, and then hope that it does improve care. And then, but the second set of programs they typically run would be far more on the development side of L&D, learning and development. So things like a clinical leadership academy. Based on our conversation today, it feels like a provider or an L&D team may be able to run both of these models concurrently, and that this continuing professional development accreditation framework, so it's NCPD, is that the
Nursing Continuing Professional Development? Mm-hmm.
Yep. And it's not a replacement. That's what I'm hearing, but I might be wrong. Is it a replacement, or do you see this being a secondary approach for those other like what you just described, where 15 hours of mandatory training isn't the way to actually engage and inspire this person?
Yeah, it's not a replacement. It's not a replacement at all. However, I do think, to your point around in education, when I was working clinically, we had this term that we used around mandatory education, and it was spray and pray. So we gave everybody the education and we crossed our fingers that no one would make a mistake, right? Because we were giving them education and then we didn't have any longitudinal assessment or longitudinal professional development opportunities to make sure that the so what of that mandatory education actually didn't occur. The problem with mandatory education is it's usually reactionary and it's not proactive. And if we're more proactive with identifying possible risk and creating educational interventions around reducing risk, the need for mandatory education might not be there because they'll be so in tune to preventing that risk through proactive measures than reactive measures to a risk that's already occurred. And so to your point, I don't think it's going to replace that, but we often like to say, as soon as a provider hears the word mandatory, their brain shuts down. And there's a thing in learning called fixed mindset and growth mindset. We need to create learning environments where the brain is going to open up and it's going to go, this is really important because we need to reduce risk here. We need to make sure that this doesn't happen to our patient. When someone hears the word mandatory, a lot of times the brain goes, who made a mistake? It wasn't me. I know better. Why do I have to sit through this education? And the likelihood of them even picking up on the smallest thing that could help them is not there because their brain becomes fixed. And so what I'd like to see is us think more proactively around professional development globally. And that's why we don't have mandates within our accreditation criteria, except for the criteria themselves. The commission is very explicit in saying, we are not going to tell you what content you can and cannot provide. That's up to you. And so what the commission would also like to see is the environment follow suit and say, we're no longer going to require mandatory education. We're going to create learning opportunities to reduce risk, to improve practice. Brain opens up, people are open to it. What you might see, though, in the future is more alignment with the traditional model to outcomes.
Yep, I would agree with that. Yep.
At the end of the day, criteria for successful completion, again, should not still be just showing up.
Yep.
A provider should want tangible data of what those learners achieved in that learning environment because, one, they need to know if it was effective, and two, they need to know what they would do differently moving forward if it wasn't.
Yep.
Or three, what they're going to do to continue to enhance that learning.
I would absolutely agree. I think that would even move to regulators, really. So accreditation of the healthcare service for the purposes of being able to provide healthcare, bill the government for the services, etc. The audits that take place that sit around that, transitioning to outcomes-based audits, people-centred. We're seeing this in aged care in Australia. Our latest revision of the standards includes between 32 and 34, depending on your service type, outcome statements, which are essentially describing the nature of care and a level of care that the participant, the older person in that case, should be receiving.
Okay.
How is it not the case that education shouldn't align to that? You know, it obviously should. It should align to a competency or capability framework that maps to that definition, and then supporting learners to move through those levels of competence against each of those areas of care.
Exactly. And maybe for the expert provider, that expert nurse, they might master all of those outcomes of care, but maybe their learning journey is not about outcomes of care now. Perhaps their learning journey is about how to teach other nurses to achieve those outcomes of care, right? Those journeys can pivot depending on, or change depending on where the nurse is in their professional practice. And so I think we have to be really open to that too, because there was some research by Price and Reichart and Price from Canada that actually was research that was done within the Commonwealth. One of the things they found was disengagement of the mid-career to late career nurses. Those are our expert nurses.
Same issue here. Yeah.
Yeah. And so they are critical. They are critical in the development, the learning journeys of newer nurses. And if they're stagnated and there's this idea, well, they've been practicing for 20 years, they know, what have we done? We fixed the brain. That brain is no longer going to be able to transfer the knowledge the way they need to the brain that needs it, that new nurse or a nurse that's less expert. So stimulating those mid to late career nurses is critically important, but how we do it is also critically important. They may not need the mandatory education. They may need different type of education.
Very likely. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's very, very, very likely they don't need that. Yeah, I agree. Maybe the thing to finish on would be to talk about how somebody engages with this. And I'll just give some background there. So in Australia, we lack this level of framework, accreditation, standard setting, and having the same level of coordination that the ANCC offers at large in the US. But that doesn't preclude a learning and development department here in Australia or a hospital or a healthcare service engaging with the ANCC. AusMed itself, and there are others globally, has been an ANCC approved provider with distinction we're into our fourth consecutive cycle with distinction. It's something we're very proud of because of, many of the things that you've brought up here today. But it is the case that a hospital here in Melbourne or an aged care service, in Queensland could engage with this. And could you talk a little bit about how they would do that, despite it being based out of America? America is a world leader in this field. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah,
absolutely world leader. So how would an Australian service engage with it? And what would the benefits to them be?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it's really important that, yes, although these standards were created out of an American Nurses Credentialing Center, a US-based credentialing center, the standards are not centric to the US. They can be applied globally. And I think that's really important. And the outcomes-based CE model is actually there's no public access to that model. An organization would have to be accredited through the ANCC in order to be able to access it.
If a L&D team were to engage with ANCC and seek that accreditation, what they'd be provided is a really clear framework around how they actually do their job.
Yes.
It's not you would no longer be trying to work parts out or maybe meander along, but you would have this rigorous framework that supports you.
Yeah, it's you're absolutely spot on. It is a rigorous framework, and it's not an easy process. It's a very rewarding process, though, because when organizations like yourself are accredited through the ANCC, they're demonstrating to the public, they're demonstrating to the nurses that they employ or the nurses that they provide learning to, that they've gone through a quality process. And our framework is based on the Donabedian model of quality in healthcare, which has been transformed from the triple aim to the quadruple aim. I think it's the quintuple aim now of people, process, and outcomes. And so we focus on the people, to your point, who are doing the work. Is the organization supporting them? Do they have the educational requirements that are needed to be able to do the work? The process is the educational design process, understanding that. Yes, it's a global process, the backward design process, but it's really centric to the ANCC in terms of what we require. And then the quality outcomes piece is evaluating the impact of the work that an accredited organization is doing. That's not just on the impact of the work they are doing as a provider, but the impact to their nurses, the impact to their patients, the impact to their community. And so it is rigorous. I do want to mention one thing that's critically important about this framework also is that we have very, very stringent standards around integrity and influence, content integrity, around best available evidence, not allowing for bias and influence, not allowing ineligible organizations to engage in accredited professional development. And one thing I'll mention about that is that all of the accreditors within the US aligned under that same model of content integrity. And that's critically important. And although that is a requirement in the US under federal law, again, those standards are being applied globally because of the ability for an organization or a person to influence the practice of a nurse when they have financial gain, when it benefits them. And so our standards help to eliminate that.
Yeah, and just for clarity there, you're referring to, say, a wound care educator may, talk at length about a specific product that they have perhaps a financial bias.
Correct.
For doing so. And in the US, it's federally prohibited.
Correct.
Yeah. I'm not sure if a similar law exists here in Australia, but that's something that we've learned through the ANCC process back in the late 2000s. Free from commercial bias and conflict of interest is imperative.
Yep.
So last little point from me, I think, is just to say in the US as well, it is actually health district L&D teams and departments that are mostly accredited. That was my observation. We being a company that was accredited, thinking, this is something that an commercial education provider would go through. But in fact, it is L&D teams in health districts across the US or health services that seem to be the predominant organization that's accredited. Is that?
Yeah, they're one of our largest, and in the US, they're called nursing professional development teams. And that's a specialty practice, actually, in the US. And it's not a specialty practice in medicine, which is interesting. And there's a great article called Integrated Continuing Medical Education by David Price. It came out of the National Academy of Medicine. He talked a lot about the impact of that not being a specialty in medicine and how in nursing it is a specialty and why it is so robust in nursing. But we also have a lot of different organization types that are accredited. We have departments of health. We have some regulatory bodies like the Joint Commission. We have state boards that are accredited. We also have state nursing associations, specialty nursing organizations like the Emergency Nurses Association, and then we have colleges and universities. Our organization type for which we accredit is pretty vast, although our healthcare organizations are the largest percentage of that.
That makes sense. And they would probably have the largest learner cohorts, I'm guessing.
Actually, in some cases, some of our education providers, like yourselves, have some of the largest learner databases.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
And this might be important for your listeners to hear, but in 2023, over 13 million nurses across the globe engaged in accredited nursing continuing professional development through the American Nurses Credentialing Center.
Wow, that is enormous.
Yes.
That is enormous.
It's enormous.
You said earlier there was 5 million nurses in the US. There's 426,000 in Australia. So that's a very big number.
Yep, very big.
How many nurses would be in the G20?
Good.
Yeah, wow. So we could talk at length. We didn't even get to interprofessional education, I've just realized.
Well,
but
we can talk about that another day. Yeah.
All right, that sounds good. Well, thank you so much for your time, Jennifer. It really is amazing to be able to cross the Pacific Ocean on a podcast and hear about all of the wonderful work that's going on in the US. The US really are world leaders in this area, and it sounds like it's even excelling now beyond the education in the medical profession as well. So it's a real template maybe of and a bit of a look into the future for us of probably what this would look like here in Australia in 10 years' time, hopefully sooner if we can make it happen. So thank you so much for making time to chat to us.
My pleasure. Glad to be here. It was fun.
You've been listening to Outcomes, a show about uncovering the hundreds of micro-innovations that help make Australia's healthcare system one of the best in the world. This podcast is produced by AusMed, one of Australia's leading providers of educational content and software to the health, aged, disability, community and allied health sectors. To find out more, head to our website, ausmed.com.au. To make sure you don't miss an episode of Outcomes, be sure to subscribe to or follow the show in your favourite podcasting app. And while you're there, please leave us a 5-star review as it really helps others to find the show. I'm Will Egan, and I'll see you next time for another episode of Outcomes.